You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Lian Dolan.
Authors. I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates. PubSite is the new, easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of one book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web. Before We Ever Spoke by Dan Largent. Cleveland, Ohio, 2006. After a chance encounter, three people soon find out that life can sometimes thrust us into the public eye, even when taking great measures to avoid it. Cooper Madison was the best pitcher in baseball after being drafted number 1 overall in 1996 from the small Gulf Coast town of Pass Christian, Mississippi. 1 year after announcing his sudden and shocking retirement, he finds himself seeking anonymity in Cleveland, Ohio. Kara Knox is the youngest sibling to 3 older brothers. After a tragic work accident to her closest relative, she has built up a tough exterior as she begins her final year of college at Cleveland State University. Jason Knox, Kara's oldest brother, is the lead detective on Cleveland's Edgewater Park killer case. After months without a suspect, he's feeling the heat from his media-hungry chief. Serendipity intervenes, and all three learn that perception and reality are paths that rarely ever intersect. Before We Ever Spoke by Dan Largent. Hey folks, you really ought to check out Patricia Gillam's Heroes of Corvus series. Book 1 is called A Superhero's Duty. A fight between a second-generation superhero named Red Bolt and a villain for hire named Icarus goes terribly wrong, resulting in the drowning deaths of 3 innocent civilians and orphaning a 6-year-old boy. Racked with guilt, Red Bolt visits Cameron Wilson at the hospital every night and won't leave the boy's side until he falls asleep. Befriended by a night shift nurse, the man in costume begins to disclose what really happened after the fight and why he feels the death of Cameron's parents and sister fall on his actions. A superhero didn't survive that night, and Cameron and the rest of the city are not out of danger. A Superhero's Duty, Book 1 of the Heroes of Corvus by Patricia Gillam. Get this series now. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, my guest is Lian Dolan, and I am super excited to talk to Lian today. She has an amazing new book. It's called The Sweeney Sisters, and I'll tell you what, we're recording this in the midst of lockdown for the coronavirus, and if we need anything we need this book, and we need books like this to remind us why we're doing what we're doing. And it's such a great book. This needs to be on everyone's bookshelf. I'll tell you that right now. Welcome to the show, Lian.
Oh, Hank, you're going to make me cry. I mean, I cry in most interviews, but usually not off the bat. Thanks very much. Yeah, I set out to write a book about family and connections and sisterhood, and I had no idea 2 years ago when I started it where we'd be right now. But I do feel like, yeah, that's what a lot of us are craving right now.
Yeah.
So thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, in a time where we crave connection and are encouraged to do the opposite of that, we need to be reminded of why that's important. And this book did that for me, that's for sure.
Oh, thanks. That's great. I love hearing that.
Yeah. But before we get into all of that good stuff that we're going to talk about, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I remember pretty distinctly in sixth grade, I had a wonderful sixth grade teacher, Ms. Olson, and we had like a literary compendium at the end of the year. We published stories and poems and this and that. And, I kept the actual book from sixth grade that our class had put together, and I realized about a third of the content in the book was me, that I had contributed poems and stories and funny lists, and the teacher was so encouraging. And I think that's the first time I really got that charge of not only seeing your name in print, but also an understanding like, oh, I really enjoy this, and I'm not bad at it. Like, I feel honestly, Hank, some of that material still holds up. Like every once in a while, I'll take a look, and I definitely had a forward, like feminist point of view in the sixth grade, and I'm happy to represent that still. So I think that was it for sure. Sixth grade. Thank you, Ms. Olson.
That is so funny. I love hearing stories like that. After your literary debut in the sixth grade,
yeah,
was this something that you kept pursuing through school? A lot of times, life has a way of getting in the way, and we take different paths and come back to writing. But what was that like for you?
I can't say that I pursued it in school. I did a lot of writing and I enjoyed it, and I felt like I was good at it. Even if it was like outlining papers in high school English, I was good at that. In college, I wrote for the school newspaper. I wrote restaurant reviews for some reason.
Nice.
But it never occurred to me that I felt like I wasn't brave enough, actually, to try really writing fiction or short story. I sort of toyed around with the idea of being a screenwriter at some point early on. And I remember my father distinctly saying, "That's ridiculous. No one makes a living writing screenplays." So that's a direct quote from Jim Dolan. And maybe like in Connecticut in the early 80s, that was true. So I really felt like I wasn't quite brave enough to do a lot of creative writing, but I was really good at like nuts and bolts writing. And my first real job out of college was working at Nike, actually. I worked in the film department there. And I was just a production assistant, but I remember like the first time I was pressed into service to essentially write a script, although my boss just said, "Hey, could you write up those notes?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, all right." And that was the first time I really did any creative writing in a professional setting.
Wow.
In my early 20s, yeah.
Your bio says that you graduated from Pomona College with a degree in classics. What
Yes.
does a degree in classics prepare you for?
Well, certainly not as lucrative as screenwriting. Should have told my dad. Honestly, when I went to school, I wanted to be Indiana Jones, right? Didn't we all? I mean, I
Yeah.
did. So that movie came out when I was in high school. I was already studying Latin. I loved ancient history. It looked romantic to be an archaeologist. I went to college and carried on studying Greek and ancient religion and did my junior year in Athens. And then I realized I just wasn't really smart enough to be an archaeologist, to be honest. It's really hard. Like ancient Greek is really hard, and you really need to know your stuff, and you need to remember like every little snippet of ancient history. And when I graduated, I was like, yeah, I don't actually think that's for me. But so what did it prepare?
There was a moment for a lot of us that had sat in a movie theater in the early '80s and watched that first movie. That there was that moment that a lot of us came to where we realized that we're just not smart enough.
Yeah.
That
Well,
happened to a
yeah.
lot of us.
Yeah, I mean, I realized I just probably wanted to make out with Harrison Ford, not actually be Indiana Jones.
We
Like
had
that.
those dreamy eyes.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, the best. So, yeah, so that was it. That was my goal. But I loved studying history and language, and you learn a lot about all kinds of people and civilizations through how their language evolved. So a lot of that has stuck around, and I've been able to use a lot of that in both in fiction and in my life, believe it or not.
So you have from your early days working at Nike and that first screenplay that you wrote, take that, Jim.
Right.
Did the desire to write keep popping up? But what was it that brought you around to writing prose that you do now?
Sure. It did. After I worked at Nike, I actually moved to Los Angeles, and I thought, okay, now I would like to embark in a film career. It helped that I married a guy who lived in Los Angeles, so I moved here, and it was the '90s, so I was going to write those screenplays, and I went to the American Film Institute (AFI) and took classes in screenwriting for the first time. So I learned the screenwriting structure. I wrote a couple of spec episodes of TV shows. I wrote a spec movie. Nothing sold, but I value that experience because I really learned a lot, like becoming a student of writing, studying structure, and then everything else I sort of read and watched after that kind of fell into that idea that, okay, there's a structure happening here. This is something I can learn. I can decide what works for me and what doesn't. And then, but then we started doing Satellite Sisters, which was first our radio show and our podcast,
right.
and
which
that
is
just
phenomenal, by the way.
Thank you. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary this month, which is incredible.
That's amazing.
So, but that really took up not only a lot of time, but also just a ton of all my creative energy. I mean, we were on the air at 1.6 days a week for Satellite Sisters. We were writing columns. I had a column in Working Mother magazine and a column in Oprah magazine. We published a couple of books. Like there was just a ton of creative work in that. And then in 2008, we were at ABC Radio. Disney sold off the radio division. So it was actually unemployment, Hank, that really focused my writing because it was in the middle of a global financial crisis. The media business was being decimated.
Oh, yeah.
And we all had to go get other jobs, but I had no other skills besides writing and talking. So that's when I thought, okay, I could either put on these red sweatpants and eat Oreos for the rest of my life, or I can take this online fiction writing class and sort of focus these ideas I've had about a novel. I can focus them. I have plenty of time now and plenty of opportunity. And that's what I did. I took an online writing class because, I knew that I needed like some public humiliation to actually get me going. I needed to commit, and like you have to turn in assignments and get critique from other writers. And so that was it. That's when I started writing fiction, and it was immediate. My last name is Dolan. So the first night the teacher said, okay, next week we need 30 pages from like the first three people alphabetically. Okay, Dolan. And that was it. I sat down and I wrote my first 30 pages of Helen of Pasadena, my first novel.
And like most writers have figured out, you can still eat Oreos part-time.
Yes, and the sweatpants I still have. I didn't need to give those up. There's no shame.
That's
No
right.
shame.
That's right. So from that first 30 pages, was this, was it kind of instantaneous for you? I hear this story from writers so often that once you open the faucet, that the stories just kind of flowed out, and you realize all of these things that had been pent up for so long. Did you have an experience like that?
I don't think it was an open faucet, but I do think I took to it right away.
Was it more like wrestling a bear?
A little bit. I mean, again, I had always really enjoyed structure. And so even when I was in high school, I would outline papers pretty deeply. So I just kind of stuck with what I knew. Like, I didn't know anything really about the process of writing a first novel. And this was before everything was online, really. I mean, there were some writing resources online, but there were just some books you could get. I was taking this class. So I just stuck with what I knew. I outlined that book basically on a screenplay structure, a 3-act structure. And I had the note cards and I had my pads, and then I filled them up and I did my character studies, and then I just plunged into the writing. But it did take a long time. I hear those open faucet things and I'm like, oh, love to get to that someday, where like, oh, in 3 months I wrote my first draft. I was a little bit more methodical, but in 9 months I had a draft I was pretty happy with. But I think the structure helped me. That sticking with what I knew helped me do something new, frankly.
Sure. Let's back up for just a minute
Sure.
and talk about Satellite Sisters, where you started on radio. Why did you start this? What was the impetus to say, I want to start a radio show with my real life sisters, and we're going to talk about everything. How did this get started?
I'm going to put the blame squarely on my sister Liz's shoulders. So there are 5 girls in our family and 3 boys. So a family of 8. But the 5 girls, we'd always been a pretty good unit, especially as grown-ups. We all got along. We didn't all live in the same place. We weren't all in each other's lives all the time, but there was a lot of calling around and connection. And sometimes we'd be roommates and sometimes we'd be enemies, that kind of thing. But we were all in our 30s and early 40s, and my sister Liz, who came from marketing and media and was a big radio fan, just said, I don't understand why everything on the radio is just men screaming about politics or sports. Like, is there no radio for like the way people talk to each other, like they talk to their friends or their sisters? And why is that not possible? And Liz is very persuasive. So she actually lured us to an all sisters weekend. It was the first time we had ever done that as adults, gone away just the sisters. And she proposed this business plan that we start a radio show that was just us connecting remotely from wherever we lived. And we could talk about the things that we talked about on the phone, which was our lives and news headlines and what movie we had seen and recipes we were cooking and health issues and wellness. And it just sounded so benign, Hank. We knew so little about the radio business that we're like, sure, Liz, sounds good. We didn't know. We believed in Liz. But she had a couple of friends in the radio business, and I used my screenwriting experience. So I had pitched and I had boiled things down into 2-page synopses and things like that. And we put together a document. We rehearsed our pitch, and we sold Satellite Sisters to a public radio station in New York, WNYC. But it's public radio, right? So you've heard. They're always begging for money. So we had to go find our own money. Like, that was not part of our scenario. We didn't understand the economics of it at all. So we're like, so we had to form a company and we had to go raise our own money for the show. And so it really became a business venture as much as a creative venture. And that's how Satellite Sisters started. And we went from public radio to ABC, then to podcasting.
I love that story. That is amazing. We hear advice for writers so often, and Stephen King mentions this in his book on writing, and it's been repeated by, and I don't even know if he originated it or whatever, but the 2 most important skills that writers need to work on is reading a lot and then writing a lot. You need to read a lot so that you understand story structure and what good prose sounds like, what good dialogue sounds like, and all of this stuff. And then you need to practice with writing. And I like to add a third to that. And what I like to add is to get out and interact with people, have conversations, and then pay attention in conversations. which is sadly becoming a lost art. But your experience with the weekly radio show and now podcast, how do you feel like that experience has affected your writing? Because you're having, conversation on purpose. You're interviewing people that have come in on the show. You're having an ongoing dialogue with your sisters on the show that builds, and, people that have listened to the show for a while, kind of understand the backstory, and I'm sure there are, little inside jokes and things that carry on. All of those things are really important for writers if they pay attention to it. How do you feel like the radio show and this kind of ongoing conversation that you're having has affected you as a writer?
Oh my gosh, this is a fantastic question. One I don't think I've ever been able to ask before. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Because it's structural. It's just formative. I don't think I would have become the fiction writer I am without having the experience doing Satellite Sisters. For all the reasons you've mentioned, you just have to be really in tune to things. One of the keys to doing a great audio show is listening, right? A lot of beginner podcasters plunge in and they just have a list of questions they're going to ask their guests, and they're going to ask all those questions if it kills them, and they don't bother to listen to the answers and form questions based on that, right? So what I got from Satellite Sisters was just a couple of things. The first is just, understanding what is important to people, and what kind of dialogue is important to people, what issues people really care about, what resonates. It's like a focus group every day. And, we can talk to big newsmakers on the show, and then we can do a segment about like our bras. And undoubtedly, like, people enjoy the newsmaker, but we get all the posts about our bras. Like, oh my gosh, this bra, that, like, it's really the small details and just that make up the fabric of people's lives, and that those details are important and meaningful. So, like, just having this broad understanding of what people care about and what they're actually interested in, that was huge and started me off. And the second thing I would say is just, back to Stephen King's writing a lot, creativity is a habit, it's a learned habit, and you really have to do it every day. And being on the radio 6 days a week, that was a tremendous amount of work. And you learn to step into that creative habit and just keep cranking out stuff, keep up the reading, keep absorbing material so you can turn it around and bring it to your audience in some interesting way. I would read everything from newspapers to magazines to books to newsletters, to billboards on the highway. We never knew where our best segments were going to come from. And that's something that I use in my writing. I have been inspired by, this new book, I was inspired by a Facebook post. So like absorbing things, being able to turn them around and put them back out into the world with your own spin on it and do that on a regular basis. All of that I learned doing Satellite Sisters as well. Yeah. And the third thing is just understanding that every piece of creative work has an audience. You don't have to please everybody. If you're trying to create anything to please everybody, it's pretty much going to be pablum. There's no possible creative thing you can put out there that everybody loves or everybody thinks is funny or everybody is scared by. So just really kind of letting go of expectations of pleasing everybody and understanding this is who I'm writing for or speaking to, and this is the kind of content that they're interested in, and this is where I know I can add my own voice. I think that also has come from the radio show.
That is so true. If you are trying to cater to literally everyone, you're not going to connect with anyone on a deep heart level.
Amen.
Because you can't scratch deep enough. Because you're always going to worry about offending someone or this not connecting with this person, and you just wind up not connecting with anyone.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean especially if you're trying to do anything with an edge or humor, that's a double, that really is constricting. So yeah, learn just writing, talking, creating for who you think your audience is. That's okay.
Right. Back to that creative writing course that you were talking about earlier. Did the writing you were doing during that course, did that turn into anything publishable, or how did your first book come out of that?
So it did. It was. I mean, it was. I created my first book in that class, and so that was Helen of Pasadena, and I feel like that I was just 100% ready to write that book at that point in time. So I was really focused. I got tremendous help from the teacher in that class. And then the other writers in the class were all working writers that may not be fiction writers and maybe not novelists, but they came from journalism backgrounds or technical writing backgrounds. So that was helpful because the critique was good. And so I slowly worked through writing all of Helen of Pasadena there. And later, after the class ended, a small group of us formed an online writing thing, and we kept exchanging pages via Google Docs, which again, in 2008 seemed very forward thinking at the time. And absolutely helped me finish and polish that book, having that constant support. And at the time, I had an agent in New York. We had a book with Satellite Sisters, and I had kind of a fancy pants agent there. And so I sent her the finished novel, and I was excited. And I mean, this was the beginning of 2010, so it's not like the economy had turned around tremendously since then. Things were still grim, but I was like, okay, all my eggs in this basket. And she never even read the book. And she let it sit on her desk for 4 months. Not even a rejection. Finally, I was like, what is the deal? And she said, yeah, I don't want to represent fiction. And I have to tell you, Hank, that was the moment. You know, even after the radio show ended on ABC, and like as bad as that couple of years had been, that was the first time I literally put my head down on my keyboard and cried. I was like, I cannot believe this. And, I'm super dramatic, but, I thought I have to start all over again, finding an agent, which can be like a 6-month process, and getting this book out into the world, if this is even good enough. And she hadn't even read it. So what I did was I called a neighbor of mine who had started a small publishing company here in Pasadena. She did travel books and food books. And she was going through breast cancer treatment at the time. But I was like, hey, I know you're busy, but would you mind reading this just to tell me if you think it's at all publishable? Because like Monday morning, I have to go get a new agent, and that's going to take months. And she said, sure, I'm going to be in all weekend. I just had a chemo treatment, so drop it off at my front door. And there was no ulterior motive. But Monday she called me and she said, I'd like to publish this book. She had never brought out fiction before. I had never published fiction before. She was a local Pasadena publisher with a national distributorship. And so we just decided to go for it, and very quickly brought it to market in like 6 months. Again, because we didn't know anything about fiction. So we did, it's women's fiction, but we brought it out in November because it has a Rose Parade tie-in. And so we thought, well, that will be fun. And right away, the book was a huge hit here in Southern California. My publisher, Prospect Park, did a great job marketing it. It became a Los Angeles Times bestseller and stayed on the bestseller list for over a year. So it was a really fun and fantastic publishing experience.
Absolutely. And Helen of Pasadena made such a splash when it came out. Were you prepared for how well received the book was, and what does that do, to you emotionally, knowing the journey that this book had been through, and then for it to finally find an audience, and not just an audience, but to really be loved the way this book was?
I was ill prepared, but I think that was the best way to be, because I know a lot of your listenership, they're working on stuff at home and they're writing and they're figuring it out. I think one of the great joyful experiences you can't recreate is writing your first book, because when you write that first book, you literally think no one's going to read it. That's the best way to write it. no one's ever going to read this book. So you write with an abandon and no fear, and you don't second guess yourself. Helen of Pasadena was a social satire, so plus a romance. So I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have been as satirical if I thought, oh, everybody I know is going to read this book. So it was really only about 3 weeks before the book came out that it occurred to me people I knew were going to read the book. I just didn't, I really hadn't put it all together because it was such a sort of a fast-paced publishing experience. And so when it came out, you sort of hold your breath. I mean, I definitely did. For the first month, I was like, uh-oh. I just held my breath. And then I remember very distinctly, it came out in mid-November. So after the holidays, all of a sudden I had tons of emails like, can you come speak at this organization? Can you come speak here? Do you know a book club? This, that. So in that next year, I did probably 100 events. That next year. I mean, I was going to book clubs 3 nights a week, speaking at organizations, like showing up at your house, just talking, even uninvited. So I was unprepared for that, but it was a real thrill and a joy.
Lian, we talk a lot on the show about the gift of anonymity with that first book. And, for all the reasons that you said, no one knows that there's a book coming, so there's no expectations. And we usually talk about that in the sense of the trepidation and stuff that comes with the second book and the fear of, following up. Is this going to be a success? And will this meet, people's expectations? And, kind of, from the writer side of that, from the business aspect of that, there's a lot of pressure that comes with a second book. What most people don't talk about is what you said, the fear of being real and being maybe as raw in a follow-up book and being as cutting or whatever the descriptor is that you're putting your heart and soul into. How do you balance that? When you got out and actually started visiting book clubs and things like that, did you still have those fears, or did interacting with people and seeing how they responded to the book, did that help to quell some of that?
I loved interacting with readers and seeing how they responded. I felt like it was a little focus group every night. And not that I would try to write by focus group, but what I took away from all those appearances with Helen of Pasadena was, what did people really love in the book? And some of it was, the real insider information they felt like they got from Pasadena. But people loved the history in the book, because that does have an archaeology storyline running through it. And so that was like, okay, I'll give that a whirl in a second. People like the humor, which is what I thought, like that the book is funny, was, I felt, my niche. Women's fiction, it's a big category. And there are a lot of books that are romance or they're drama, but I felt like there was a slot for me in humor, that I could bring my observational humor that I had used on air to fiction. I felt like I could do that. And I felt like that did work, that absolutely was something that people really liked about the book. So I felt like I wasn't tongue-tied when I went into the second book. I was actually pretty excited to write it because in between, Hank, I had had kind of an interesting experience. Helen came out, and then I was working on another project. I sold a television show to Nickelodeon based on my podcast called The Chaos Chronicles. So in between the two books, I developed, sold, and wrote the pilot for a TV show. It was like a family sitcom that Nickelodeon had bought. Unfortunately, the show never went to series. They instead picked Scott Baio's show, which I can't even talk about. That's upsetting. Super upsetting. But
Stupid Scott Baio.
I can't even. But Shachi. But the experience of working on TV, which is so different than sitting at home by yourself writing fiction, was super helpful to me. Like, I loved it. It was a great exercise. Again, it was a good experience, even though the show didn't get bought. Like, running through, we had to create A, B, and C storylines for 50 different episodes, like to prove to the producer team that, like, yeah, this is a real series. Here you go, ABC. Like just running through these creative exercises and honing the pitches and drilling down on the character development. And I really have always enjoyed writing dialogue, but, TV script is all dialogue. So dialogue. And I just love that experience. So by the time I was able to sit down and write Elizabeth, the First Wife, which has a Shakespeare theme and a funny take on contemporary Shakespeare, I was ready. So I was ready to do it.
And after Elizabeth, the First Wife, you've obviously followed that book up with the book that we're talking about today, the Sweeney Sisters. I'm really intrigued that all three of your novels, while they all have a very similar feel, and they're definitely in your voice, they're all very different books. The Sweeney Sisters we've got these three sisters, and they are very characteristically the Sweeney Sisters. There's so much they share. And then we've got this other person who kind of gets interjected into their story. Where did the idea for this book come from?
Well, I felt like it was time to write a book about sisters. Having sort of been a professional sister through Satellite Sisters for 20 years, I was like, okay, I'm ready. I didn't really want to give my sisters any kudos or props. I didn't want them to think I was writing a book about them. So I really stayed away from it. Yeah, no. Yeah. But also, that's one of those things where that was a tested idea on the radio. Like, I knew people were really interested in sisters because we hear from people who either have a lot of sisters that say, listening to you reminds me of my family, or conversely, we hear from people who don't have sisters and say, I always wondered what it was like, and now I know. So I had the basic, desire to write a book about the sister relationship because it's not all warm and fuzzy all the time. We're not all exactly the same. We don't always agree. We have very different lives, and that's okay. You can have the same parents in different lives. So I wanted to capture that. And then I saw a post on our Facebook group at Satellite Sisters. We have a closed group, and someone had posted a photo, and it was like three people in their 50s, and the copy was very simple. It was just like, I'm not going to go into details, but we just met our half brother this weekend, thanks to a DNA test, and here we all are, woohoo! And and everyone's giving like thumbs up and heart, and yay, and I gave a thumbs up, but then I thought about it, Hank. I'm like, but is it thumbs up? Is it really, like, to have someone show up in your life if you're in your 30s, 40s, or 50s, and all of a sudden they're part of your family? What does that do to family dynamics and the sister relationship and birth order? What does that do to how you feel about your mother and your father and your new father or your new mother? I mean, there are just a lot of questions. So I just thought there was that was the jumping off point for the book. Like, there was a story to tell there to combine those two things, sisterhood and this sort of midlife awakening.
Well, in our family, we've been through something a little similar to this. My wife is the youngest sibling in her family, and her dad had a couple of other children from a previous marriage that ended in a horrible divorce, and then the two parents moving to opposite ends of the country. So my wife had this whole other family that she had never met before, and a couple of her older siblings had met them when they were very young, but it had been a long time, and no one had kept in touch. And then when the internet came along, she looked up her siblings and formed a relationship, and now they're very much a part of our family. And but that does bring in some interesting dynamics to the family at large, and everyone's relationship is very different. And so we read this book kind of through that lens. And like, oh wow, she really nailed this, and it was really eye opening and kind of heartwarming, But tell me about What is it about the Sweeneys that make them such an iconic family?
Well, they have a famous father. In the book, their father is a literary lion. And I think what comes along with that, imagine like John Irving meets John Cheever. That's kind of what I was going for. So, I think that comes with a lot of swagger and ego. And so that gets translated to the family. I think they also have a mother who's very accomplished, but never quite gets her professional due, but is a really solid, anchor for them and gives the young women, the three sisters, a lot of confidence in themselves to be themselves. So even though there are ups and downs with their family life and their parents' marriage and health issues and all kinds of things, they do have the sense that we are a family unit and we're pretty good at being the Sweeneys. And I would say that is very true of the Dolan sisters. My actual family, like we were a big family. There were 8 of us, 10 people in the house. We just had a strong sense of who we were as a family, the Dolans, whether you liked us or not. We were solid being the Dolans. And I feel I wanted to imbue the Sweeneys with that same sense of pride in who they were and swagger in their family.
Well, then we have this sister that comes in who is a Sweeney sister, but has not gotten to partake in the family. How does this unravel, and what does that do to the sister dynamic?
Well, so Serena is the secret sister, and she discovers, much to her surprise, that her father is not who she thought, and her father is instead Bill Sweeney, this famous literary lion. And but what I wanted to create with Serena was someone who herself had a lot of doubts and hesitancy about what this meant. In the research that I did, and even in reaching out to some of the people in our Facebook group who, secret behind the scenes, they didn't want their names in the book or thanked or anything like that. But, what their experience was when they found this out or found out they had a different father. Like, it happens every day now. Every day someone has just found out, oh, my father's not my father or mother, or I have a sibling. I think people have a lot of hesitancy. It's not always this fantastic bit of news for everyone. And in fact, for most people, I think it's probably not. It's kind of stunning and really makes you dig deep. And in the case of Serena, here she was someone who grew up in the kind of the opposite of the Sweeney family, or she was an only child. Her parents were, these very waspy Connecticut family where they didn't discuss a lot of emotional things. They were just a lot more concerned about sort of doing the right thing at all times. Serena's a really button-down journalist. She's not prone to emotional swings or dramatic confrontation. She just keeps her head down and does what she needs to do. So this created a lot of chaos within her that it really took her a while to understand. And so that's what I wanted to create, that tension that, it wasn't like all good all the time. Woohoo, I have a big family now. That everybody in the equation has a lot of questions.
Right. And Serena, right from the beginning, I mean, she's a blonde amongst redheads.
Yeah.
There's immediately this divide. And one thing that I love about this book is that, there's some really deep subject matter here, but it is a hilarious read.
Thank you.
How important is it to you to talk about serious things, but in a lot of times a tongue-in-cheek way, or tongue-in-cheek's not even the right term, in a way that allows us to see ourselves and to almost poke fun at ourselves. That there's a lot of that in this book. A lot of, hey, don't take yourselves quite so seriously. This is life we're talking about. This is not to be taken seriously. Like, how important is that to try to help people to balance the over serious with the, this is just what you get.
100% I can say that came from our big Irish Catholic family background where, humor was the solve for us. It was the glue that kept everything together. It's how you can suppress and deny human emotions and issues. Just make a joke out of it. Like, that definitely is a huge part of who I am as a person, that I see most things through the lens of humor. Some things are super serious and they should absolutely be taken that way. But if you can just take one step back, take a deep breath and find a little bit of humor in the situation, it kind of helps you move forward throughout your day. So it's just definitely a big part of who I am as a person and how our family operated and still operates today. As a writer, I felt like that was my niche. When I talked earlier about finding the audience, like there are a lot of really great writers out there and they're killing it with the literary fiction, or they're digging deep for their metaphors, or they're writing these, poetic prose that makes you want to cry. I'm not that writer. Like I always felt like my strength was observational humor. And that's something I've been doing my whole life. It's how I see the world and it's how I've learned to communicate what I think. So for me, humor was essential. And you're right. I think 99% of people have a sense of humor about themselves. That's what I found. Writing fiction, writing, some satirical fiction, you find out who doesn't have a sense of humor about themselves because they like to email you and say things to you. But most people can see themselves and have a good laugh at themselves. I think that's true. So I like to sort of find that sweet spot.
Do you still struggle, like you did after the first book, with pulling punches and knowing? Does it get easier? Does the confidence grow the more you write, as to worrying about what people are going to think and how they're going to take things, and should I self-censor?
We're still fragile, egotistical messes, writers, right? So that
yes.
So yes and no. One of the reasons my first two books were set in my current hometown of Pasadena, and I went back to my, town of birth, Southport, Connecticut, for this one. I felt like I wanted to mine new territory, that maybe I had sort of done everything I could do in Pasadena for a while. But I was sensitive to the fact that I haven't lived in Connecticut for 20 years. I didn't want to get it wrong. So I tried not to pull any punches, but I also didn't want it to be a complete book of memory. Like, this is the way it was, so I'm going to assume it still is that way. So I wrote the book, but afterwards I did have a bunch of people that currently live in Southport read it. Like, is this still true? Do people still do this? Like, am I getting this right? And I think it was to check that. I mean, I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't taking unnecessary shots at a town, or, calling out satires, things that were no longer happening. And no, people said, no, the town never changes. You nailed it. So that's good. Like, that's why we need Connecticut in our lives. It never changes.
That's so funny. That's so funny. I assume your sisters have read the book.
Two of them have. Yeah. I have, it's not a, here's the thing. My sisters mock me, but, I have a group of readers, other writers who read the book. And my editor from that first online class that I took, the novel writing class, she still works with me. I still hire her to work with me on books because she's so good. But so I don't let them read it during the process because they're not writers. Their notes would not be that helpful. And so as it turned out, my sisters, Liz and Julie, have read the book. After it was done, I handed them an advanced reader copy and they both read it and really enjoyed it. My sister Monica and Sheila made it very clear they want to buy the book properly because there are no free copies in our family. No free copies, Hank. They're going to buy the book and read it like everybody else. So I gave them the option, and that's what they decided to do, which is great. So yeah, I mean, it's one thing that is weird about having my sisters also have their own personalities. They're known through our work on Satellite Sisters. So the big difference is if I'm writing about sisters, people know my sisters.
Right.
So I had to work really hard to not make the sisters in the book my sisters, because to mix up things. And are there certain characteristics of older sisters and middle sisters and younger sisters that I stuck with? Sure. But, and I did tell my sisters at one point, every bad thing we've ever done is going in the book. It's just not going to be named, and no sister will be assigned and things like that. But I did have to work sort of extra hard to create sisters that were clearly not my sisters.
Oh, that's so funny. And having a built-in audience that's in on the jokes is probably a blessing and a curse.
But both things. You're absolutely right. Because a couple of listeners have gotten advance copies, and they're like, okay, I have a lot of questions. And immediately they go to, is this Liz? Is this Sheila? Is this Julie? And that's fine. That's okay. And hey, it's great to have engaged listeners and readers. I'll take it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I meant what I said at the beginning of the show, Lian. This is a book that we need right now. The Sweeney Sisters is available everywhere now. There's links to it in the show notes of this episode. Lian, if people are just learning about you and want to dig into all of the amazing stuff that you do, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Yeah, the best place is my website. It's just liandolan.com, and that will have links to books and our podcasts. And then all the great thing about being named Lian, Lian, that no one else is that you can get all your own handles on on the interwebs. So my Instagram is at Lian Dolan, my Twitter is at Lian Dolan, and my Facebook is Lian Dolan. So that I'm really... yeah, no tricky names, just Lian Dolan, Lian.
Excellent. We'll put links to all of that in the show notes of this episode. Lian, this has been so much fun talking. I love the book. We're going to send everyone to pick up their copy. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for this thoughtful interview. I enjoyed it.